Hello and welcome to another Hollywood Wargaming unit review for Bolt Action, and today we are going to be looking at the top 10 vehicles for the Soviet faction. And the Soviets really are an interesting faction in Bolt Action because they not only get US lend-lease vehicles, but they also can make use of lend-leased vehicles for the British, and because of that, I would recommend cross-referencing my top 10 vehicles video for both the British and the United States if you're looking for a comprehensive guide on what to get for your Soviet faction. That being said, the Soviets have some great tanks of their own, which gives them one of the most eclectic selections of armor, and a very colorful way to fill out that tank slot in your regular reinforced platoon. But as always, this is a video covering the Soviet vehicles only, which means vehicles built and used by the Soviet Union. And it's also a top 10 vehicles list, which means we're going to be lumping in some non-tank vehicles, such as weaponized lorries or SPGs, into this list. And on that note, we'll jump right into our number 10 vehicle, and this is going to be the GAZ AAA Quad Maxim truck. And when taken as a regular, this is going to cost you 60 points, and it is going to be a soft skin truck with a 360-degree quad-mounted medium machine guns with the flak special keyword. So what you have here is a soft skin vehicle putting out 20 small arms fire shots with those machine guns at range 36 inches. And in these videos, I talk a lot about vehicles that work as a sort of infantry supplement, and the GAZ truck definitely fits in line with that sort of ideology. You're going to be putting out more small arms firepower than most infantry squads, while you're only costing a mere 60 points. It's also going to be a highly mobile unit on that wheeled vehicle chassis, being able to move 12 to 24 inches and executing additional turns. However, the reason this ranks so low on the list is because it is a soft skin vehicle, which can go up into flames relatively easily if you're hit by small arms firepower. And while I will recommend other soft skin support vehicles as a sort of better chassis to mount artillery pieces on rather than having it in an infantry crew, it's worth noting that usually those weapons can loiter in the backfield out of small fire's range and return fire without being hit by other small arms fire that usually range up to 36 inches. And that is not the case with the GAZ truck. You are going to need to be in that medium machine gun range, and if enemy infantry that you're targeting does have a light machine gun, which they often will, they're going to be able to fire right back at you. It's also worth noting that this does take up the tank slot on an armored platoon, which means that it's going to be competing with much heavier vehicles that are going to have a lot more staying power on the field. Again, one of those vehicles that I think would have much more utility in that armored car slot, and I do wish Warlord was a little more flexible with these types of vehicles. But next up on our list, at number 9, we do have the whopping KV-2, an iconic vehicle for the Soviet Union, and one that's gained a lot of notoriety in recent years, thanks to games like World of Tanks. And at 300 points for a regular, you are going to get one heavy tank with an armor value of 10, sporting a turret-mounted heavy howitzer with that beautiful 4-inch high explosive profile, a coaxial and hull medium machine gun, and it's also going to have the slow special rule, which means it's only going to move 6 inches on an advance and 12 inches on a run order. But it's also going to have the slow turret special rule, which is very much akin to the heavy load special rule, where this tank cannot be the first unit in your force to activate when you draw an order dice. Another friendly unit must be activated before you put an order onto the KV-2. And if this were a tank destroying vehicle that was meant to fight other armor, this would be a death blow to the unit. However, it's not the case here because this is a heavy howitzer vehicle. It is going to be targeting infantry, so you're really not going to be too worried about activating first to get the best shot off on an enemy tank. However, you are going to have some scenarios where there's going to be a nice ripe infantry target in front of you, and if you're not activating first, they may have time to activate before your KV-2 and escape the jaws of that heavy howitzer. But the fact that this tank has 10 plus armor means you're not going to have those situations where you're sweating bullets to activate this tank before it blows up. So while that slow turret trait is definitely a drawback, especially when combined with the slow special rule, it's not the end of the world. And as I've mentioned in previous videos, that heavy howitzer is absolutely lethal to enemy infantry. This thing is going to be deleting squads every time it hits them. It's also going to make your foes absolutely terrified to enter buildings and other standing fortifications as cover. Because with 3d6 hits against buildings, this thing is going to have no trouble bringing them to the ground. It's also worth mentioning that unlike the AVRE, this tank does not have with the petard special rule, where it can only fire at medium range, that means you're going to be able to fire this heavy howitzer at a whopping 72 inches or up to 84 inches if you are firing indirect. And while I usually always recommend you run tanks as a regular, you could actually run the KV-2 as an experienced tier, and that's going to save you 60 points, taking it from 300 points down to just 240. That is a significant decrease. And if you're sitting this thing in your backfield and just using indirect fire to volley in and hone in on enemies, that may be a good way to save points. However, for the most part, I think that running this thing as a regular and having it direct fire at your opponents is the way to go. But overall, the reason the KV-2 ranks so low on this list is because of its hefty price. At 300 points, you're going to be struggling to fit this thing in a reinforced platoon at anything under the 1250 point range. But if this vehicle does show up on your list, it is going to be the backbone to it, and it is going to be doing most of the heavy lifting, and you will likely win or lose the match depending on what kind of hits you can land. So you're really going to need to focus on levying your odds, positioning this thing properly, and making sure you're getting those good dice rolls, and not tarnishing your chances to hit by moving too much or blocking your lines of sight. I should also mention that you can work around the slow turret special rule by snapping to this vehicle with a nearby officer, seeing as the officer is technically acting first before the KV-2, which will still allow you to more or less get the first draw here. And if you are a Soviet player looking for just a sort of big block of a tank for your centerpiece for your army on your shelf, even if you don't plan on using that vehicle that much, this is definitely a top tier contender. Much like other vehicles like the Tiger, I think it's one that even if you're not going to use it that much, it is essential to a collection for Soviet army. And if you buy that Warlord Italieri kit, you're not just getting the KV-2, but also a KV-1 turret that you can put on top of the same chassis, so you're getting a lot of utility out of just buying one vehicle. But as I've said earlier, it's not going to be showing up in every game just because of its high point cost. And that's going to move us along to our number 8 vehicle, which is the Katyusha rocket truck. And this is simply going to be a soft-skin vehicle with a forward-facing multiple launcher attached to it. Very simple and similar to things like the Opel truck or the Quad Maxim GAZ. However, unlike both of those vehicles, this is a multiple launcher, which means it's always going to be hitting on 6. So you're going to be able to take this thing as inexperienced very reliably and run it for just 64 points. And unlike the GAZ truck that I mentioned earlier, this is going to have the range that's going to allow you to sit in the backfield far away from enemy small arms fire and avoid losing your vehicle due to the nature of that flimsy soft skin trait. And again, this is just more or less a highly mobile chassis to be carrying that multiple launcher artillery piece on top of. It's not super fancy, but it is going to allow you to saturate your enemies with a barrage of that heavy mortar 3-inch profile. And with some lucky rolling, multiple launchers really can turn a game in your favor, especially if they're staying alive and firing off every turn. However, the reason this does rank so low on our list is because this also, much like the GAZ truck, takes up that tank slot in a reinforced platoon, something that's going to be hotly contested by other vehicles. And while I do find multiple launchers useful, they're a bit too erratic to form a sort of backbone for your force, which this slot is usually reserved for. And if you're running this as a multiple launcher, I would recommend running the M30 artillery piece alongside it, so you're going to saturate your enemy with more than just one multiple launcher each turn. But that being said, this is another iconic Soviet vehicle, and one that if I were to have a Russian army, I would 100% buy. This is Stalin's organ, and I think it's a great thing to have in your collection, and one that can actually come in handy in smaller point games around that 500 point limit. But with the Katyusha wrapped up, that'll move us along to our number 7 vehicle, which is the Su-122. And at 180 points for a regular, you are going to be getting a medium tank value armor of 9 with one forward-facing medium howitzer with a 3-inch high explosive profile. So this is a pretty rudimentary vehicle overall, but I am a big fan of that 9+ medium armor, and I'm a big fan of the medium howitzer. And while it is a drawback to have that medium howitzer mounted on a forward-facing casemate, I will note that the Soviets do not get access to the Sherman 105 variants. So if you're looking for a rudimentary medium tank with a medium howitzer, this is definitely an option for you. I think having a medium machine gun would do a lot more favors for this vehicle, but at the same time it is relatively cheap, and with that medium howitzer profile, you're going to be able to sit it in the backfield, aim it downrange, and just pelt away at any enemy infantry that dares to show their face. It's not flashy by any stretch of the imagination, but it is a nice, solid chassis that's going to get you a reliable medium howitzer onto the field. Something that the Soviets just don't have a whole lot of options with. But after that, we are going to move along to our number 6 slot on this list, and that is going to be the T-60 light tank. And this is more or less your Panzer II equivalent. It is going to be a light tank with an 8 armor value, a light autocannon with that HE 1-inch profile, all for just 100 points. And again, this is taking that light autocannon artillery piece and putting it on a chassis that is relatively durable, mobile, and also not breaking the bank. If you're looking for a light tank that can play aggressively as a sort of support role behind your infantry, this is a very good option. However, unlike the Panzer II, you're not going to get the Recce special rule option, which is a bit of a drawback, but it's not the end of the world here. I don't think it's fully necessary, as vehicles like this tend to be ignored by enemies, especially if you have other larger targets on the field. And compared to its other light tank counterparts that often sport a medium machine gun and then a light AT gun in the turret, I much prefer these variants. They're less expensive, and you get a lot more utility out of that autocannon than you would a light AT gun. And again, that comes down to the fact that you're getting more shots with the autocannon. In a game that is reliant on hit modifiers, you're going to have more chances to do damage on your enemies, put pins onto them, and get your points worth out of this vehicle. So again, not a very flashy vehicle, but a pretty reliable one and an inexpensive option at that. And that will move us along to our number 5 vehicle on this list, and that is going to be the T-34-85. Now at 235 points, you are getting basically your Panzer IV-H, or your Sherman EZ-8 equivalent here. It is a medium tank with an armor value of 9, sporting a heavy AT gun in the turrets, with a penetration value of 6, and a hull-mounted medium machine gun. And while this does match my logic of armament exceeding your armor value, much like the other 2 tanks I compared it to earlier, you're not getting any national characteristics here that are going to benefit this tank too heavily, such as the buzzsaw, Tiger Fear, or the gyro stabilizers. And this is definitely going to make the T-34s a little bit less desirable than their American or German counterparts. However, it is worth mentioning that you will be able to get tank riders on these guys, so there is a slight bonus to taking tanks in general with the Soviets. But that still does require you to buy another unit that has a premium fee for that ability, so I'm not really chalking it up as a bonus to this vehicle. However, it is a very iconic Soviet vehicle along with the T-34-76, but at 235 points, I don't think it's going to fit in with most lists, especially at the 1,000 point range, but I could see it shining in that 1,250 to 1,500 point range. It's not a wild overinvestment, and it is going to be able to deal with heavier tanks like Tigers. And I'm going to echo a lot of the same sentiments for our next vehicle on the list, which is going to be the T-34-76, coming in at number 4. And for 195 points, you're getting that medium tank armor value of 9, with a medium anti-tank gun with a penetration value of +5, with a hull and coaxial medium machine gun. It's your generic medium tank, but again, it lacks some of those national characteristic bonuses like buzzsaw, gyro stabilizers, and when you compare this next to the other Shermans, which the Soviets do get with lend-lease, you're missing out on that 75mm with the added high explosive profile. But keep in mind, you are paying for that gun with an extra 10 points, so the Sherman variant equivalent to this is going to be 205 points, while the T-34-76 is only going to be 195. It's a relatively affordable utilitarian vehicle, and I do have a lot of love for medium tanks overall. I think they fit well into most lists, and don't overinvest into one specialization. They can fight tanks, they can fight infantry, and they can stave off most attacks. And this again is an iconic Soviet vehicle, so I think a lot of Soviet players are going to collect the T-34-76 or the 85, and personally I would choose the 76 over the 85, just because that heavy AT gun is quite expensive and it's not always necessary. But with those 2 relatively generic tanks wrapped up, I'm going to move along to our number 3 slot, and we're going to have some interesting contenders for the top 3 on this Soviet tank list, the first of which, at number 3, is going to be the T-28. And at 155 points, you are going to be getting a light tank with an armor value of 8, sporting a light howitzer in the turret with a coaxial medium machine gun, 2 MMGs mounted in turrets on the hull, both of which cover the front arc, and one of which will break off to cover the right arc, and another that will break off to cover the left arc. It also automatically includes a pintle-mounted medium machine gun that can be fired with the flak keyword. So while this definitely isn't the brawniest of tanks, it is packing a lot of firepower on that light tank chassis. In fact, it's very comparable to the A9 Cruiser CS variant that we saw in our British Top 10 Vehicles video. But my biggest complaint about that vehicle is that it just didn't quite have strong enough armor to support all those weapons on it. And for just 30 points more here, you are getting bumped up from that relatively fragile 7 armored carrier chassis to a light tank chassis of armor value 8. And that's really going to help keep you safe from things like light autocannons, light howitzers, and anti-tank rifles. As I've mentioned before, that leap in 1 armor value between that 7 to 9 range is always an astronomical difference. And on this vehicle, taking the extra 30 points for that extra protection and a pintle-mounted medium machine gun is a phenomenal upgrade, making this a much more ideal version of that A9 CS. And as I went over with that vehicle, you're going to have those 2 medium machine guns on your hull, combined with a light howitzer or coaxial machine gun, which is just a ton of firepower coming out of a single vehicle, and it's really going to punish any enemy that it focuses on. It can also split its fire in multiple directions and put a lot of pins on multiple targets. You can also let rip that pintle-mounted medium machine gun for a total of 15 shots, or 20 shots if you choose not to fire that light howitzer, but I think 15 shots and a light howitzer blast is going to put most enemy infantry units into the dirt. Just remember that using that pintle-mounted machine gun is going to turn your vehicle open-topped for the turn. And at 155 points, I think this is just a great, affordable vehicle that's going to deal a lot of damage against enemy infantry. And even if it is lost to enemy armor on turn 3 or 4 or something like that, which is when you usually end up losing tanks, there's a good chance if you've played this tank right, you would have already made your points back by then. I think it's a phenomenal vehicle if you're not too worried about enemy armored presence. And at 155 points, I think you could even cram it into smaller points games and really give your enemies a unit to reckon with. But this is one of those relatively bizarre interwar period vehicles, and because of that, I don't think it's going to show up in a lot of Soviets collections. It also seems to be a bit rarer of a model to find, but I would definitely recommend checking it out. It's definitely more of a hipster Soviet tank, if you will, but one that I'm actually quite fond of. But with the T-28 out of the way, we are going to be moving into our second tank, and this is going to be the SU or ISU 152. And this is one of those rare late war Titan tanks that actually becomes viable in this game. It is probably the most expensive tank that's made it this high on any of these lists at 290 points, but with those points you're getting a heavy tank with an armor value of 10, with a forward-facing heavy howitzer. Again, that's the HE 4-inch profile that I think is absolutely devastating in bolt action. It is going to have the slow load special rule, which is the same as the KV-2's slow turret traverse rule, which means you're not going to be able to activate it on the first dice you pull in the round. But as I mentioned earlier, on a heavy tank, that's not the end of the world. You're going to be able to take your time with these guys and not worry about getting blown up by a quick draw enemy tank. And if you really do need to get that shot off, you can always snap to with a nearby officer. But the SU-152 does have one other rule that is an absolutely phenomenal one, and that is the big shell special rule. And that's going to up the penetration value of your shots to 5+, rather than the standard 4+ you would get with that heavy howitzer profile. So essentially, you are going to be able to fire this thing as either a medium anti-tank gun or a heavy howitzer, both of which are very potent weapons in the bolt action game. And having that dual utility on such a durable tank really is going to help justify that 290 point price tag. It's also worth noting that in bolt action, high explosive weapons do not lose penetration value when being fired at long range. So while a medium anti-tank gun would usually be penetrating on a 4 at long range, again that's above 30 inches, this is going to be able to go all the way up to that heavy howitzer range of 72 inches without losing that 5+ penetration value. That is extremely powerful, and I am very much a fan of that rule. And even though I rarely say that vehicles above 250 points can fit into that 1000 point game, I think the fact that this vehicle has the ability to absolutely delete infantry units and take on most tanks in the game means you probably can fit this into a 1000 point game. You will have to make a lot of concessions, and your match likely will wholly rely on how it performs, but I think it has the tools to perform very, very well. That being said, I think it is definitely going to shine more so in those 1250 to 1500 point games. And I know a lot of people in bolt action do not like those casemate mounted guns, but with that whopping 72-inch range on that heavy howitzer, I don't think you should be too worried about getting flanked, because you can really position this tank in the back fields and hammer away at your enemies from optimal distance. And though I've done it in other videos, I really want to lament how great that heavy howitzer 4-inch HE profile is. It's something that's going to absolutely crush your opponents, and prevent them from maneuvering into certain defensive positions on the battlefield. I should mention that this tank can also be given a pintle-mounted heavy machine gun with 360-degree arc of fire, but 9 times out of 10 I'm not a fan of the HMG and I would probably skip it on this vehicle. But that's going to move us along to our number 1 vehicle on this list, and I'm sure to many people's surprise, it is going to be the Su-76. Now this is a very humble, relatively early war self-propelled gun, and something that I think many bolt-action players aren't going to be too familiar with. And this is really one of those few vehicles in bolt action where I think the rules do a good job of reflecting the actual vehicle, as it is a cost-efficient mobile artillery piece. It's definitely not as flashy as any of the Panzers, but this is the type of thing that really wins wars, especially when produced in mass numbers. And for my recommended build for this tank, at a regular crew veterancy, you are going to be coming in at 125 points, and that is going to be getting you a light tank with an armor value of 8, sporting a forward-facing light howitzer with that HE 2-inch profile, and we're going to give it the versatile upgrade, which is going to allow it to fire as a medium anti-tank gun with that +5 penetration value. And while this is an open-topped vehicle, you can also negate that open-topped rule for +5 points, turning it into an Su-76I. And while I would highly recommend taking that upgrade, I think a lot of people are not going to be taking it because the Su-76I is a very ugly vehicle, and I don't think I've ever seen a model of it on the tabletop. But if I were running my Su-76s in a casual game, I think I would take that upgrade and just let my opponent know ahead of time that they're not open-topped. Because being open-topped is really actually a terrible rule for vehicles to have, and it really should take away more than just 5 points from the vehicle's overall cost, as receiving pin markers from small arms fire is going to greatly reduce their efficiency overall. But when you look at this vehicle overall, for just 125 or 130 points, you are basically getting a platform that sports a reverse-engineered version of that 75mm cannon. And rather than it being a medium anti-tank gun that can fire with an HE 2-inch profile, it's a light howitzer that can fire with a medium tank gun profile. It really is essentially the same weapon, and I think this is maybe one of the most ideal platforms for that 75mm gun. In my US video, I talked about how the Chaffee was the ideal chassis for the 75mm, and I think for dueling tanks, it still might be, especially when you consider that it's mounted on a turret on that vehicle and has gyro stabilizers and recce. But really, with that tank, you're not going to want to be firing it as a light howitzer. In fact, with a lot of tanks that sport that 75mm cannon, you are going to sort of feel guilty when you're firing it with that light howitzer profile because you feel like you're paying for so much more than that. But that is not the case with the Su-76. It is only 125 points, and if you're popping off that light howitzer at infantry targets, you're not going to struggle to make your points back. And should an enemy vehicle present itself, then you have that very powerful 5+ medium anti-tank gun to penetrate its armor and potentially kill it. And I really hope that makes sense, because I think that is something that really makes the Su-76 shine here. It is affordable and also very versatile, which is great to have in that very limited reinforced platoon that only lets you have one armored vehicle in that slot. Much like the previous Su-152, this is going to be able to handle multiple battlefield roles, because there will be times where tanks like your T-34-85 aren't going to have an enemy vehicle to shoot, and there will be other times where tanks like your KV-2 isn't going to have infantry to shoot. So having a tank that can dial in on either or when opportune, especially for cheap point cost, is a pretty great asset to have. And again, even though this is a forward-facing casemate weapon, you are going to be able to sit back at that 48-inch range and plink away from a distance. So if you want a versatile vehicle, and you don't want to have your entire list run around it like you would with the Su-152, the Su-76 is definitely going to be the way to go. And I think in those 1,000-point games, this is going to be a solid choice for any Soviet player to run, especially when you consider that it is only taking up 13% of your list points, meaning you're going to be able to cram more infantry into that Soviet horde of yours. And I know that might be a controversial pick for my top vehicle on the Soviet list, but keep in mind that as a whole, vehicles are relatively underwhelming in bolt action, and a lot of people get carried away with tanks a lot more than they should. And most of the time, taking a relatively low-cost vehicle that is utilitarian is going to help support your infantry to help win them the game, rather than overshadow them and become the crux of your entire list. So I hope you understand where I'm coming from with this selection, but if you disagree, please leave a comment below with any suggestions you have, There might be some tanks that I missed that I would have considered putting in here. I'm not a Soviet player, so I did have to do a lot of research on this video, and every now and then things do slip through the cracks. But I think I've got most, if not all, of the more viable options in this list. But if you're a Soviet player, leave a comment below. What do you like to run? Are there any vehicles you think I left out? As always, explain your reasoning. And if you liked this video, consider subscribing, turning on notifications, leaving a like, and until next time guys, take care.